Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, I would like to welcome you all here in the single kerk tonight. To be able to have you, Ms. Julio Alvarez, as tonight's guest speaker is something the John Adams Institute is very proud of. I hope she's not so nervous as I am, since being hostess of the evening is new to me. I am Monique Knapen, and I just recently succeeded on a wartime as director of the John Adams Institute. It's a great job, and I'm happy to serve you. As you might know, the John Adams Institute has, since it was established in 1987, evolved into Europe's leading forum for cultural exchange between the Netherlands and the United States. We have been blessed by the participation of many of America's greatest minds. I feel tonight's lecture is going to be one of those beautiful and inspiring events and fits therefore beautifully into our series. Thanks to our volunteers who have assisted us in many ways, the John Adams is capable to bring the best of America to Amsterdam. That also goes for our donors, sponsors and friends who help to make this financially possible. For tonight's lecture, I want to gratefully thank Luiting Seithoff, Ms. Alvarez's Dutch publisher, Penguin Books Benelux and Instituto Cervantes, the Spanish Cultural Center in Utrecht. Ms. Julia Alvarez is a Dominican American author who is a great storyteller. She has the gift to lure you away and lead you through her beloved places in the Caribbean. I should say. I am very honored that tonight she's willing to talk about her latest work, In the Name of Salomé. Ms. Alvarez will be introduced by Ms. Magdalena Perkowska, and Ms. Perkowska is an assistant professor of Latin American literature at Leiden University, and a specialist in Latin American historical novels. She will start off with introducing Ms. Julia Alvarez in more detail. After Ms. Alvarez's lecture, Magdalena Perkowska will discuss some issues with our guest speaker, and you are kindly invited to join in and ask questions. There is a microphone in the aisle, you probably have seen it. There will be no intermission tonight, and after the lecture, Julia will sign books, and there are drinks available in this church bar. The evening will close at 9:30. One more announcement, and I think it's quite obvious. Smoking is not permitted in this beautiful church. And please switch off your cellular phones. And now I will hand over the floor to Magdalena. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Well, I am terribly afraid of mics and of English. So, I will start this evening by speaking from a little bit more academic point of view about Julia Alvarez and her work. As you all know, she was born in the Republic. In 1960, her parents, herself, and her three sisters fled the island because a conspiracy against the dictator Trujillo, in which Julia's father took part, was uncovered by the secret police. The family settled in New York, which is a usual destination for many Latin American exiles. In the US, Julia went to American schools and universities, and it opened for her the door of a new language in which, years later, now, she would narrate her experiences, her quests and discoveries. And also now, by the turn of fate, Julia is not only a writer who tells her stories in English, but also a professor of creative writing in Middlebury College, where she teaches American students the art of the language that was once totally strange to her. Julia has been writing for many years. She begins with poetry, to which she dedicates almost exclusively in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we have 3 books of poetry published until now. The first one, Homecoming, which was published in 1984. Then The Other Side, El Otro Lado, published in 1995. And the second edition of Homecoming, under the title Homecoming, New and Collected Poems, which appeared in 1996. The discovery of Julia's talent as narrator came relatively late, first to her short stories and later with her 4 novels. How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents in 91, In the Time of Butterflies in 94, Jo in 97, and In the Name of Salomé in the year 2000. This is the book about which we are talking today. And to this list we have to add one more title, which is a book of essays published in 98, Something to Declare. Now, the four novels, and I will speak only about the novels now, form a very coherent corpus, or as one critic said, a real corpus continuum. Within it, certain themes, such as the contradictory experience of exile, both personal and familiar, with its losses and quests, the political, social, and historical circumstances that led to it, the history of the homeland, La Patria, the feminine identity and history recur obsessively, converging and expanding from one novel to another, as if these, the novels, form a circle of concentric waves. This corpus can be divided into realms or groups, defined by the type of memory that dominates the writing, the personal and or the historical political memory. How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents and Yo belong to the first group. The former, How the Garcia Girls, tells the story of the 4 Garcia sisters and their parents when the family emigrated to New York, fleeing Trujillo's persecution. The novel depicts the new reality to which the girls and their parents try to adapt. Yo concentrates on the story of Yolanda, the third of the Garcia girls, nicknamed Yo-Yo or Yo, and the title is a pun because Yo is not only the protagonist's name but also the first person pronoun in Spanish, yo, I, ik. The story is narrated from the point of view of multiple and heterogeneous characters, both Latinos and Americans, who have felt offended when Yolanda published a novel in which they appear as characters. This is an obvious relation to How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. And they, the characters in the novel, present us in this text with their own perspective and word on Yolanda. Both novels explore the construction of identity, having as their central theme the experience of exile, the feeling of being separated from one's roots, and the quest of identity in a place and society where the dominant culture and language are markedly other. Through this approach, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents and Yo participate in an important tendency called Latino literature, represented by such authors as Cristina Garcia, Rodolfo Anaya, Sandra Cisneros, Oscar Hijuelos, Ana Castillo, y Denise Chavez. On the other hand, both novels develop also the theme of quest of female personal identity in a patriarchal society, a quest which involves exploration and definition of sexuality. This explains the place occupied in How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, but also in other novels, by the figure of an authoritarian and conservative father, compared more than once with a dictator, and sometimes with the dictator, and who attempts to control the mind and the body of his daughters. The theme of women who, in quest of their bodies, souls, and identity, must confront a father, a brother, or a husband who define them for his convenience, runs through all of Julia's novels and connects her writing to that of so many other Latin American women writers, such as Luisa Valenzuela in Argentina, Clarice Lispector in Brazil, Diamela Eltit in Chile, Ana Lidia Vega and Olga Noya in Puerto Rico, Zoe Valdez, a writer from Cuba, and Ángeles Mastretta from Mexico, to name only few. The novels of the second group, In the Time of the Butterflies and In the Name of Salomé, continue to explore the pursuit of identity, but the approach is that of a return to the roots, to the island, the territory and time of origins, in order to discover there the political, social, and historical traces inscribed in oneself. Return thus to the past, to history, to historical memory. In the Time of the Butterflies, narrates the brutal assassination of the sisters Patria, Minerva, and Maria Teresa Mirabal, called butterflies, mariposas, in the coded language of the underground. The sisters were murdered by orders of Trujillo in November 1960. The novel is closely related to the novel of the dictator. This is a genre deeply rooted in the Latin American literary tradition, and its trajectory includes such brilliant works as The President by Miguel Ángel Asturias from Guatemala, The Autumn of the Patriarch by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and very, very recently, in the year 2000, Mario Vargas Llosa's La Fiesta del Chivo. I don't know if it's already translated into English. A book about the dictatorship of Trujillo, just like in the Time of the Butterflies. The last novel, In the Name of Salomé, reconstructs the life, struggle, and pursuit of two women, two Salomés, a mother and a daughter. Salomé Ureña, the writer in whom the conscience of the nation and La Patria merges with the founding of the Dominican literature by women, and her daughter, Salomé Camila Enriquez Ureña, whose life as an exile was a long voyage between the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and the United States, where she was, as Julia Alvarez is now, a professor at an American university. Now, both novels, In the Time of the Butterflies and In the Name of Salomé, construct female characters whose historical memory suffered a double fate. On the island, the butterflies, las mariposas, and Salomé Ureña became legends. Meanwhile, outside the Dominican Republic, they are practically unknown. In both cases, they don't belong to history. These novels recuperate them for history. They inscribe and revive them. They make them known to the public, and they restore to them their human faces. In this sense, In the Time of the Butterflies and In the Name of Salomé may be considered as examples of yet another important tendency in Latin American literature practiced by many very well-known authors, the new historical novel. However, the historical memory collected in documents, testimonies, and collective memories is permeated in these novels with personal memories and perceptions. With personal memories and perception of the writer in such a way that the historical and the personal become almost indistinguishable. History, memory, autobiography, and imagination interweave in Julia Alvarez's writing, which can be described as a journey towards a land of foundation, of roots, which is also always a land of hard wrench, of separation, of exile. Thank you.
Please, Julia, come. Well, I'm not that sure.
They're not Dutch height here. Thank you. Thank you for all of you for coming. I'm going to embarrass myself, but Guten Abend? A little better, buenas noches. And now the language that I really work in and know, good evening. I want to thank Magdalena. I sat there and I felt more and more tired. I've had so many babies, so many books, I don't realize that I've done them all, and they're all out there now. So thank you so much for a thorough introduction and helping me understand some of what I've been trying to do through story. And I want to thank the sponsors tonight, Instituto Cervantes, for bringing me here, and of course the John Adams Institute and Wartime, and Monique Napen, sorry, and my wonderful publisher, Lighting Saitov, Hanka Leping, and of course Tile, who has been our godmother and fairy godmother here. Obviously, Julia Alvarez, Julia, I don't know how you say it in Dutch, Alvarez. I'm originally from the Dominican Republic. I came to the USA when I was 10 years old in 1960, and I became a writer in my adopted tongue of English. But many people ask me what kind of a writer I am, and I call myself a truly American writer, meaning the whole hemisphere, in that many of my characters, my stories, my material, my inspiration comes from the southern part of the hemisphere, but I write in the English that by accident I came of age in and made myself up in, which is English. So in that way, I think of myself as a truly American writer of both hemispheres. But many of my topics, many of my themes come from my Dominican background, and this is especially true of In the Name of Salomé. And I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the process by which I discovered these characters, Salomé and her daughter Camilla. But it might be a little spotty for some of you that might not know the history. So just in capsule form, as Magdalena spoke of, Salomé Ureña was born in 1850, which was 6 years after the birth of her country, the independence of her country in 1844. So she and her young country were coming of age together. She came from a humble family. She was a woman at a time when women were not taught to read or write, so they couldn't receive or answer love letters. So women were analfabetos. She became the first national poet in the country at the time when women were in that situation. She was a mulata woman, a woman of color, at a time when the upper class, the people in control of the literature in the country were Spaniards, white people. And also she was an uneducated woman that sort of educated herself. So this was astonishing to me that this woman became the national poet, the poet that was helping the young patriots in the country understand themselves as a country. Was asking the questions in poetry and answering them in the way the poems answer questions about what the national identity was. So the patriots would recite her poems, they would write them on walls. So this was the woman that intrigued me. By 30 years old, she was the bestseller in the country. And she gave up, this further intrigued me, she gave up writing after she was at the height of her powers, because she felt it was indecente that women that she was writing, and yet women were unable to read her work. So she started the first school for women in the country. So in capsule form, this is a little bit about who this woman was. And when she died, very young, she left behind, besides 3 sons, an only daughter, Camilla. And I became interested in Camilla because she was very anonymous. She had a her father, Salomé's husband, became president of the country. She had a famous brother, very strong, powerful, famous family, and she wanted to remain anonymous. She went to the United States, was a teacher for a long time, and was a very conservative, quiet, removed person. And then in 1960, when she had tenure at Vassar College, she was head of the department. She was comfortable, pensioned. She gave up her tenure and her pension and her security to go to Cuba and be part of the literacy brigade there. And she lived there till 1973 when she died during a brief trip to the Dominican Republic. So you see, these 2 women are bookends for me from 1850 to 1973. It's the history, it's the century, that turbulent century when Latin America was really in the throes of defining and finding itself. And so in a sense, through these women, I was able to muse and meditate on what it was to be a Latin American. And in a sense, I'd say that this is the novel in which I found my Latin American self again, even though it's written in English. So that said, what I want to do is take you through sort of a narrative of how I discovered these characters and the kinds of places I had to go to and the people that I met. And I brought some slides because it brings it immediately to you what that process was. And I don't know if you want to turn down the lights and I have this little light to read my talk with. Would that make it easier to see the slides? No? Or do you think you can, is that easy or not easy? No? You could still, okay. Oh, I just want to see that yeah, okay. So, I call this Searching for Salome and Searching for Camila. Growing up, I knew very little about Salome Ureña. Of course, I had heard the famous name as a child. Sometimes when we drove to the center of the old city, my father found a parking spot on Salome Ureña Street. On the way to Mass at La Catedral on Sundays, we passed El Instituto de Señoritas Salome Ureña, which I thought of as a reform school because there were bars at the windows and a watchman at the door. But I didn't know that Salome Ureña was one of the most revered poets of the Dominican Republic, La Musa de la Patria. I didn't know that she gave up writing poetry to found her Instituto, the first school for females in the country. Then, about 5 years ago, a friend presented me with 2 books she thought I should read, a slender volume of poems by Salome Ureña, and the other a collection of the family's correspondence. I don't read Spanish easily, but I decided to struggle through both books, a dictionary in hand, and relearn my native tongue. I have to smile when I think that 100 years after her death in 1897, Salome Ureña, the great educator of Dominican women, was teaching me my history and native tongue through her poems and her letters. It was a favor I knew I would someday have to pay back. As I finished the collection of family letters in Salome's book of poems, I became more and more intrigued with a young mulatto woman who had defied all social norms to become the national poet of her young country. I wanted to know more about her and the times in which she had lived. On my frequent trips back to the island, I wandered the colonial city, poking into old churches and houses, searching for Salome. The house where Salome had spent her childhood and young adulthood was boarded up. The neighbor across the street told me that in the most recent past, it had been a cheap hotel housing illegal Haitians. A few months back, the place had been raided and now the house stood empty. The outside walls had been so heavily whitewashed over the years that the engraved stone was barely visible. When I finally spotted it, I stroked my hand over the stone for good luck. It says, Aquí vivió y floreció Salome Ureña de Enríquez, poetisa y educadora. Here lived and flowered Salome Ureña de Enríquez, poet and teacher. From Salome's house, I headed for the Instituto, deserted in the late afternoon. In the front entryway, in a sunken pit, a bronze bust of Salome gleamed menacingly. The plaque underneath it was missing some letters, perhaps an act of vandalism by one of the students forced to sit in the pit for misbehaving. The old sereno, the watchman at the door on his stool, had not noticed the missing letters. Yo no sé mucho de letras, he confessed. He didn't know how to read. As for who Salome Ureña was, he wasn't very sure. A very important woman, he guessed. When I asked why he thought so, he shrugged his shoulder. She has a big building named after her. Everywhere we went, I was shocked by how many of Salome's countrymen and women did not know their letters. In circumstances far different from mine, and for a different set of reasons, they had not learned their history. Analphabetos, they could not claim the stories and poems that were part of their legacy. Salome had given up her writing to devote herself to her instituto, believing that only through the power of the word and the worlds they unlock could a people be free. Had she failed so miserably in her mission? Sitting in the office of the historian Aristides in Chastegui, I asked him this question. We exchanged one of those sad looks that would become a staple of our conversations about the tragic history of the island and of Salomé Ureña in particular. She lived 47 years, and during those 47 years, there were 31 changes of government and 60 revolutions. This is why we need to know our history, Aristides said in his deep, resonant voice. A former opera singer, Aristides has a tenor's broad chest and a historian's astute eye for the little details that speak volumes about the past. I spent many afternoons in his small book-lined office talking about Salomé Ureña. They wanted her to be white, Aristides explained about the Enriquez, the family she married into, about the Enriquez response to the mulatto poet who married into the family. He showed me a copy of the only existing photograph of Salomé Ureña in which her negroid features and kinky hair are apparent. Very fuzzy. And then the successive whitened, prettified portraits of the poet, including the one commissioned by her husband, Don Pancho, from a London portrait painter. Only the little cross remained, Aristides noticed, pointing to the crucifix around Salomé's neck. And this is the official portrait now. It speaks volume to our racist tendencies. From Aristides, I learned about Salomé's young husband, 10 years her junior, Francisco Enriquez y Carvajal, Pancho for short. A strikingly handsome young man. He must have convinced himself he was in love with the poet as well as with her poems. There was no question that Salomé fell passionately in love with him. They married when Salomé was almost 30. Pancho had just turned 20. Soon, her hands were full with 3 young sons and a school to run. There was not much time to write or much inclination to do so. She had lost her faith in her constantly warring patria. Her short life had its own tragedies. Salomé struggled to keep the Instituto afloat in an increasingly repressive dictatorship. Pancho's departure for France for a second degree in medicine, a proposed 18-month stay that in fact lasted 4 years. There, in Paris, he began a second family. When Pancho finally returned from Paris, Salomé was already ill with tuberculosis and bitter over his long absence. A difficult pregnancy sapped her remaining strength. She died 3 years later in 1897 at the age of 47. She left behind the 3 sons and her only daughter, little Salomé Camila. From the collection of family letters, I was able to piece together the main outlines of Camila's life. Salomé's only daughter had ended up in the United States teaching Spanish for many years at Vassar College, and a surprising serendipity at the summer language school at Middlebury College, where I now teach. This shared detail of our lives seemed to me a green light from the muse. The search for Salomé widened, and I began looking for her daughter as well. But the search for Camila turned out to be much harder than the search for her mother. Nomadic and elusive, Camila was impossible to pin down. Almost every decade in her 79 years found her living in some different place. Tall like her mother, white like her father, pale enough that she could pass as white in the United States pre-civil rights, Camila Enriquez Ureña preferred to remain anonymous and to pass as white. She had taught in the States until in 1960, as I mentioned, she moved to Cuba to join the revolution. In 1973, she died during a brief visit home to the Dominican Republic to visit family. During one of my visits to the Dominican Republic, I learned that the last of Camila's 3 half-brothers was still living. A series of calls of introduction finally procured me an invitation to visit the ailing 90-year-old man. Don Rodolfo sat in his rocking chair in the Galeria with a removed look on his face, hardly aware that I was there. It turned out that this, my one living source, was suffering from Alzheimer's. I felt a wave of sadness both for his personal tragedy and for the loss of all those stories. Don Rodolfo's oldest daughter was polite but wary at first. As a descendant of Don Pancho's second marriage after Salome died, her loyalties naturally lay with the second wife. But she warmed up when she discovered that I was here to talk not about the famous first wife, Salome Ureña, but about her dear aunt Camila. Out came the photograph albums, the letters, the stories she had heard from her father, as well as her own memories of her beloved tia. She was interested in everything, the niece recalled: the man sweeping the street, Caruso singing Otello, the rise of the miniskirt. The photographs she shared with me attested to the many faces and facets of her Aunt Camila. Salome's beloved little girl, the photo I showed you just now, the sullen stepdaughter who had lost her mother and whose father had remarried a little too soon to a young girl who had been taking care of the mother and had already, there is some question, was already the mistress living in the house. So the sullen stepdaughter, the poised first daughter of President Pancho when her father became president, the glamorous career woman at Vassar College, and the old woman in Cuba in a flowered house dress. "Do you know where she is buried?" I asked as we were parting. Before I left the Dominican Republic, I wanted to be in touch with a place that held some part of Camila. "In the old cemetery as you leave town," the niece said. "She's buried in our old family plot, but I haven't been for a while." The Cementerio Máximo Gómez is a maze of vaults and mausoleums lined up on both sides of a narrow passageway. I followed the niece's directions, but I kept getting lost. At each turn, I was besieged by boys and young men offering their services as watchmen and weeders of the plots. I engaged several of them to help me in my search. I told them the stone has the name Camila Enriquez Ureña written on it, but that didn't help them any. They wanted to know the details of what the tomb looked like. Were there any angels on top? Was it situated near one of the trees in the graveyard? Suddenly it struck me. They didn't know how to read. After a dragnet search, I spotted the stone down a narrow alleyway. No statuary, no eternal flame, nothing to distinguish it, an abandoned grave. A straggly bush half covered the bottom stone where Camila lay buried. All the rest of her relatives are in the national pantheon, but she chose that she wanted anonymity even in death, so she's buried in this plot. And it seemed a fitting end for the shy woman who had craved anonymity all her life. Back in the States, I drove down to Poughkeepsie to meet with two of Camila's former colleagues at Vassar College. Both women corroborated what I already knew. Camila was hard to get to know. A very private person, one of them volunteered. Perhaps she was homesick. In fact, in all the time Camila had taught at Vassar, 17 years, all during the Trujillo dictatorship, she had not returned to the Dominican Republic. I walked the beautiful campus trying to imagine her. The old venerable buildings seemed full of their own stories. This is still the grave. Yeah. Rockefeller Hall, where Camila had taught her Spanish classes, had that stately, bricked-in look of Ivy League colleges. How odd that this light-skinned black woman had chosen to live quietly in this small town by the Hudson River, teaching Spanish to upper-class American girls. Back home, she could have lived comfortably as the first daughter of a former president and beloved child of a national icon. But Camila refused to accept any honorary post that would have made her a feather in the cap of the dictator. An old photograph from when she taught at Vassar. Before I left town, I found the old house where Camila had lived in the attic apartment for many years. I had half a mind to ring the doorbell and ask to see the place, but something stopped me. On the trail of my character, I suddenly sensed that I should stray no further into documentation, or I would lose the Camila who had already begun to live vividly in my imagination. Of the few details that I gathered about her, perhaps the most intriguing was the choice Camila made in 1960. On the eve of her retirement from Vassar, as a 63-year-old woman, Profesora Enriquez tore up her roots, gave up her tenure and her pension, and headed for the revolution in Cuba. It seemed a baffling choice given her timidity and her reserve and her conservatism. Convinced that I had to follow her to Cuba in order to understand her, I applied to the USA State Department for permission to travel to Cuba. My husband said that maybe here you might not know that the United States still has an embargo on Cuba after 41 years, so that you can't travel there unless you make an application and it's approved. So surprisingly though, a few weeks later, my papers arrived. As a novelist with a tentative novel in her head, I of course thought of these little doors opening, details falling in place as a deeper permission from my characters to proceed in my search for them. In Cuba's National Archives, I hunted among her papers for any clues that might help me understand Camila's brave but baffling choice. I found notebooks and folders full of poems she had written in her late 30s and 40s, each one carefully dated, a school teacher's good habits. At the bottom of each page were 3 sets of initials, JRJ and PHU and MHU. Beside each set was a brief summary of what the famous poet Juan Ramón Jiménez or her brother Pedro Enriquez Ureña, or her other brother Max Enriquez Ureña, also a literary critic, what they had said about that poem, almost as if Camila were keeping a tally of how each poem fared among her readers. Then, abruptly, the poems stopped. I recalled a letter in the Epistolario from Pedro, her famous critic of a brother, to Camila, urging her to give up writing poetry. And I quote, "There are enough good poets in Spanish. If you are not going to be among the best, it is silly for you to continue." It must have been very difficult to hear this pronouncement from her favorite brother, a Norton lecturer at Harvard, whom Camila loved and admired. Here's Pedro when he was at the Norton lecture at Harvard. Over and over in her papers and letters in the archives, I found mention of Camila's special friend, Miss Marian, a fellow student at the University of Minnesota, where Camila had gone for a graduate degree from 1917 to 1920. Miss Marian, from Wisconsin, had dropped out of college and followed Camila to Santiago de Cuba. For a decade on and off, she lived with Don Pancho and Camila and the old aunts, founding a dance academy, the first modern dance academy in Cuba, and breaking enough social codes to keep everyone, not just her dancers, on their toes. I wondered over the nature of this close friendship. Rumors abounded among her students and colleagues in Cuba that Camila was gay. And yet she seemed also romantically inclined towards several male beaux as well. A handsome soldier in Washington, D.C., a young poet in Santiago de Cuba, a sculptor in Havana. With each new story or rumor, I vacillated. Yes, no, yes, no. I felt a little like Camila tallying up the votes at the end of one of her poems. I spent long days at the archives, skipping lunch, afraid of losing a minute. When the library closed for the weekend, I explored the devastated city, searching for Camila. After decades of an embargo that has slowly starved the economy, and with the collapse of its former ally, the Soviet Union, Cuba is a country in ruins, frozen in times past. The skyline I could see from the roof of my hotel had not changed since 1959. This, of course, ironically meant that the city of my characters was still standing, or often in Havana, crumbling before my very eyes. From one of my contacts at the archives, I found out that Camila's former maid was still living. Maria Meserene sat outside a barracks-type building getting some fresh air. In a city with a severe housing crunch, she counted herself lucky to have a room to herself. Originally from Syria, her family had emigrated to Cuba at the turn of the century and opened a store in the small city of Holguín. When she was 15, Maria had run off with a man who brought her to Havana and then dumped her. Homeless and penniless, she had befriended La Profesora, Camila, who offered her a job and a place to live. "What do you remember about her?" I asked. "She was so tranquila, never a harsh word." I blurted out the thorny question I did not know how to ask. "Did no one else live with her?" "Her students were there all the time," Maria answered, not understanding my meaning. She scowled as she recalled the trail of muddy footprints, the cafecitos she was constantly making for each new arrival, the books stained on the coffee table, the torn curtain she was later blamed for. They could not get enough of her in the classroom. They might as well have lived here. Maria was right. Camila's students were everywhere. Mention her name and someone knew someone who had been her student at the university or at a community center or at a factoría literacy class. At the College of Filosofía y Letras at the university, I visited, oh, there she was, La Profesora, when she went back to Cuba. La Universidad. But I visited Camila's old classroom, run down and shabby but still in use. The faculty room soon filled with her former students, now professors themselves, eager to share their stories of their beloved profesora. One student recalled, she bothered by being so unwilling to bother. The student explained that La Profesora used to walk every day to the university from her apartment in Miramar, a very long distance, probably not for the Dutch, you're used to, but a very long distance, a woman in her late 60s. One time, the student recalls, I offered to drive her home after class. They would all wait, the students, after class, trying to get her to drive her and take her because they were worried about her. One time, I offered to drive her home after class. I had an old run-down 56 Chevy, and those of you who have been to Cuba know that all the cars there are from the 50s. I had an old run-down 56 Chevy, and wouldn't you know it, just when I wanted to make a good impression with the profesora, we were driving along, the car caught fire on the way to her apartment. Flames shot out of the hood. I screamed, stopped the car, jumped out. People rushed from their houses with buckets of water. After we put out the fire, I looked around for La Profesora, and there she was, sitting quietly in the passenger seat with her hands folded. I ran up, opened the door, and cried, Profesora, are you all right? Yes, of course, she said. What a lovely ride. From Havana, I flew to Santiago at the southernmost tip of Cuba. Soon after Salomé's death, Don Pancho remarried and moved his new family to Santiago de Cuba, the new family, and Don Rodolfo would be the littlest boy standing up, probably to your left. So Don Pancho remarried and moved his new family to Cuba. This is Tibisita, the young wife that was a nurse to Salome and one of her children, half brother to Camila. It was here that Don Pancho in Cuba was living as an exile when a steamboat arrived from the Dominican Republic one summer afternoon in 1916 to tell him he had been elected president in absentia of the Dominican Republic, Presidente Pancho. The city historian of Santiago de Cuba, Ricardo Repilado, I called him up when I arrived there. He was reluctant to receive visitors. Over the phone, he explained that he had applied for and was still waiting to receive his teeth, so he could not enunciate properly. But after hearing my story, how far I had come, how I only had a few days in Santiago before going back to Vermont, how I was interested in the city where Camila Enriquez Ureña, who had been his teacher, had spent her teens and 20s, he agreed to meet with me. I arrived at the pleasant little cottage to find Don Ricardo sitting in the galeria, a kerchief at his mouth. In case he should smile, he wanted to spare me the sight of his toothless gums. Don Ricardo explained about his teeth. They removed them all because they were in bad shape, and they promised me a new set. But with the embargo and all the scarcities, well, the teeth never come. I go 1 week, they say we've had an outbreak of dengue fever. Please come back next week. Next week, there is an epidemic of conjunctivitis or another wave of hepatitis. Bueno, ¿qué se va a hacer? University or at a community center or at a factoría literacy class. At the College of Filosofía y Letras at the university, I visited, oh, there she was, la profesora, when she went back to Cuba. La universidad. But I visited Camila's old classroom, run down and shabby but still in use. The faculty room soon filled with her former students, now professors themselves, eager to share their stories of their beloved profesora. One student recalled, she bothered by being so unwilling to bother. The student explained that La profesora used to walk every day to the university from her apartment in Miramar, a very long distance, probably not for the Dutch, you're used to, but a very long distance, a woman in her late 60s. One time, the student recalls, I offered to drive her home after class. They would all wait, the students, after class, trying to get her to drive her and take her because they were worried about her. One time, I offered to drive her home after class. I had an old run-down 56 Chevy, and those of you who have been to Cuba know that all the cars there are from the 50s. I had an old run-down 56 Chevy, and wouldn't you know it, just when I wanted to make a good impression with the profesora, we were driving along, the car caught fire on the way to her apartment. Flames shot out of the hood. I screamed, stopped the car, jumped out. People rushed from their houses with buckets of water. After we put out the fire, I looked around for la profesora, and there she was, sitting quietly in the passenger seat with her hands folded. I ran up, opened the door, and cried, Profesora, are you all right? Yes, of course, she said. What a lovely ride. From Havana, I flew to Santiago at the southernmost tip of Cuba. Soon after Salomé's death, Don Pancho remarried and moved his new family to Santiago de Cuba, the new family, and Don Rodolfo would be the littlest boy standing up, probably to your left. So Don Pancho remarried and moved his new family to Cuba. This is Tibisita, the young wife that was a nurse to Salome and one of her children, half brother to Camila. It was here that Don Pancho in Cuba was living as an exile when a steamboat arrived from the Dominican Republic one summer afternoon in 1916 to tell him he had been elected president in absentia of the Dominican Republic, Presidente Pancho. The city historian of Santiago de Cuba, Ricardo Repilado, I called him up when I arrived there. He was reluctant to receive visitors. Over the phone, he explained that he had applied for and was still waiting to receive his teeth, so he could not enunciate properly. But after hearing my story, how far I had come, how I only had a few days in Santiago before going back to Vermont, how I was interested in the city where Camila Enriquez Ureña, who had been his teacher, had spent her teens and 20s, he agreed to meet with me. I arrived at the pleasant little cottage to find Don Ricardo sitting in the galeria, a kerchief at his mouth. In case he should smile, he wanted to spare me the sight of his toothless gums. Don Ricardo explained about his teeth. They removed them all because they were in bad shape, and they promised me a new set. But with the embargo and all the scarcities, well, the teeth never come. I go 1 week, they say we've had an outbreak of dengue fever. Please come back next week. Next week, there is an epidemic of conjunctivitis or another wave of hepatitis. Bueno, ¿qué se va a hacer? There are worse things. And with all the scarcities, there aren't any treats to eat anyway, he added with a wink in his eye. With Don Ricardo as navigator, we drove up to the quaint hillside neighborhood of Vista Alegre, where Pancho had moved the family soon after his arrival in Santiago. The houses all looked like petit fours, little candies, prettily decorated with widow's walks, columns, and curlicues. But up close, the paint was peeling, the front steps crumbling, many windows missing. We stopped in front of a pale blue house, shaded with palms and surrounded by a high iron fence. This was Don Ricardo's boyhood home, where La Profesora came every afternoon to give lessons. It turned out that Camila had been one of his first teachers. Down the street, we found the house where Miss Marian had opened her dance academy. Don Ricardo pointed out the wide veranda with a dance bar running the length of it. Classes were conducted al fresco. She taught in the Isadora Duncan School, which was scandal in Santiago de Cuba. Classes were conducted al fresco. I used to come up to the iron gate to peek in at all those barefoot girls in tunics. Kerchief at his mouth, he was no doubt smiling at his naughty memory. Did Camila dance as well? I wondered out loud. Don Ricardo thought for a moment. I can't say I ever saw her dancing, he admitted. I think she preferred to watch. She was too shy to perform. But her friend Marian, what was she like? Don Ricardo looked at me, sensing there was something else I wanted to know. But before I could ask his opinion of Miss Marian's special friendship with Camila, he reminded me, I am a historian. You are the novelist. As we said goodbye, Don Ricardo handed me a small brown parcel. Tears sprung to my eyes when I unwrapped it, a rare 1920 edition of Salomé's poems compiled by her son Pedro. It was an astonishingly generous gesture in a country with a scarcity of everything, including books. I cannot accept this, I told Don Ricardo, shaking my head. It's too much. Listen, he scolded me. I'm an old man, and when I die, no one will end up with this book that will get as much pleasure from it as you. How can I ever repay you, I said, taking the book back. Don Ricardo pressed his lips together in a queer smile so as not to show his pink gums. Of course, we both knew how. 2 years later, I revisit Camila's tomb in Santo Domingo and lay the finished manuscript before her stone. I stand by, feeling awkward, not knowing what to do at these rituals I seem to set up for myself. For the last 4 years, this book has filled my life with its demands, its secrets, its rich cast of characters, but now my work is done. For a moment, I am overwhelmed by a feeling of emptiness and also of gratitude as I think back over the many helpers, Camila's student jumping from her burning Chevy, Da Sereno at the Instituto struggling to learn his letters, Aristides with his theories, but first among them, of course, Don Ricardo, smiling as he turns the pages of my book, flashing the full set of teeth my imagination has provided for him. And there it is, going back with a finished manuscript. I call it my Caribbean genes that I need to have a ritual when I finish a book and to find the tomb and say, here it is, I finished it. So the lecture is now also finished. Thank you. And as you know, novelist, the German poet, philosopher, says that novels arise out of the shortcomings of history. So you've heard the history, but it has so many shortcomings that you must buy the novel and learn about everything that is missing from it, because novels can do what history can't. Okay? A plug for the novel. So now we rise up to... Yeah. No, it's fine.
Yes, because it's there.
Lower. Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
Too high.
Take a seat.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Julia, thank you for this beautiful and fascinating history of a story.
History
I would
of a
say.
story.
Yeah. That was really fascinating for me. I work on a historical novel, so it's beautiful and interesting to hear how a writer arrives to his story, or her story in this case. Now, what I would like to ask is how this historical materials, the documents that you gather, the testimonies, the interviews, how do they transform in characters? How is what sort of work does the imagination do with all these details? What happens later?
It's strange because it's not a process that is easily defined. Some sort of chemistry goes on, and it sometimes is something that you weren't looking for, which is becomes so important for what you're writing. You think that you're looking for these facts, but some little detail, like a little detail that shows up in the novel was when these colleagues I met in Vassar that were talking about her reputation and her good teaching and her scholarship and all of this stuff. One of them said, and yes, remember how she always wrote in pencil because she didn't like her mistakes to show. Whoa, the character comes alive in a way that all the documentation about her scholarship and the classes she taught didn't do. So these things start creating the character in your head. And then the thing is, for instance, when I was gathering material and I thought I showed the house where she lived and I wanted to see it. And then I thought, oh, it would be so wonderful to go inside and see it further. And something says stop, because the point is to take it in and for them to become characters. If the documentation becomes too heavy, then you move into the area of nonfiction and biography. So it's some strange chemistry happens. Of course, you need to know the history and the facts and read the poems and know about the scholarship and go to the archives, but it's the little things. The fact that she started writing poems privately and then only showed them to 3 people, and then at the bottom of a very carefully copied out poem, the 3 initials with a little summary of what each had said about it, gave me so much about that character, more than even what the poems were. So it's these little things that bring a character into life, make them become alive in your head.
So we could say that the imagination works in the space between lines of the document of history, where the little space is left, something said but but or just mention and then it sparks.
It sparks something,
something,
right?
something.
But I believe I believe history is a fiction anyhow.
Of course,
it's the story. It's the story
Yes.
of what happened, of what really happened. But it's a story.
Yes.
It's a narrative.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's another question. That takes me back a little bit to in the time of the butterflies. There was one critique about the book that the book doesn't show on the surface the work with the documents. I refer to this contemporary tendency of, showing to the reader the process of selection, of interpretation, of working with the documents. And the critique was saying that your text is perhaps too smooth. How would you counterattack
It's
this?
perhaps
too smooth on the surface, that you don't see the work of the on the documents. How would you counteract this critique? I think
You mean the work on the documents? I guess I don't understand the question. How I don't see.
Yeah, this we have now in Latin America, but also in the American historical novels, for instance, a lot of novels in which and a very important process in the novel itself is to show the reader how the process of writing, working with the documents has occurred, and I suppose that a critic took your novel and said, well, she tells the story, but there is the work on the documents shown.
Yeah.
So how would you counteract?
It's really interesting you say that because
this sort of critique.
Well, one way is to just say you can't please every reader,
Of
and
course.
you can never please a critic.
Yeah.
Because
sometimes.
Sometimes. But it's very interesting because when I was, a novel is something, it's organic, it grows and you discover what its form is going to be. Originally, I had meant, and in the time of the butterflies, I had little clippings from newspapers, little, sometimes a report from the SIM, documents I unearthed, and what I meant to do was to put them in between the chapters to give historicity or whatever.
Exactly. That was probably what the critique was.
to the novel.
Yeah.
And in the process of writing it, I felt that it interrupted the narrative flow. It was an imposition from the outside, and the device that I used instead was Maria Teresa.
Yeah.
Because I decided that Maria Teresa, by keeping a journal, could be, a journal gives the daily happenings, could give the little things that are happening, that this was going to be, ironically, even though it was a little young woman's journal, she would say, today there is a strike. And there was actually a strike, but it would come as it would have come to them through the process of the character.
Yeah.
And so I thought of her very much as the character that kept us informed of what was happening on a basic level. But I lifted all those documents. I have a whole huge folder of all the things that were going to go in the novel that were going to be coming between the chapters as a way of placing it historically. But I found that it really interrupted the narrative flow. It was the imposition of a writer trying to give credibility to her text rather than being true to her characters, and novels are the truth according to character. Of course, historical novels are these amorphous beings that want to be everything at once, so they also want to have some historicity, but they're novels finally, they're novels, yeah.
And I think that you always manage to interrupt the flow because your novels are all your novels include different perspectives, and the characters. There is a play between the visions and the characters. We could say that they reflect like in the mirror.
Yeah.
Sometimes this is a very close reflection. Sometimes it's completely they are seen from one character to another, like in a espejo concavo o convexo.
A concave mirror,
yeah, a concave or convex mirror.
A convex,
So they don't reflect exactly. And I think it's very interesting procedure also. because
I'm
even in the Name of Salomé,
Salome,
you have a very beautiful play of mirror between the mother and the daughter.
I'm interested in multiplicity of stories. I think it's I've heard different theories about it, that it comes out of a Latin American sense of la familia. You never are just Julia. You're Julia, Julia and Eduardo's daughter, and that there's always a whole clan, and many points of view. Never one person gets a chance to finish a story at a supper table in a Dominican household. It has not been known to happen. So that I've heard it said that it's part of the Latin American. I think it's also part of a woman's perception. A lot of novels now written by women take multiple perspectives instead of the traditional trajectory of the male hero achieving a kind of epiphany. So I think it's a different maybe way of understanding reality. But I'm certainly much more interested in how stories, in a multiplicity of stories, because when you grow up in a dictatorship where there is one official story, you're very, very wary of the story, with a capital S, the official story. So, the multiplicity feels a lot more.
It's always a way
to offset that kind of.
I wouldn't like to take all the time to discuss myself with our guests. So you are invited now to ask questions, to make comments, remarks. The microphone is there, and are there any questions? Yes, gentlemen.
Did you grow up in a family where people told stories?
Oh, did I grow up in a family where people told stories? I always say that I became a writer because I came to the United States at the age of 10, and I became a reader. And so when you read, you get interested in writing many times. You want to create too. But I can't deny that my roots as a storyteller comes from my Dominican background. It is an oral culture, and it's a storytelling culture. I grew up, never seeing many books in my house, never a reader, but there were stories everywhere. There were stories about everyone, and it was very much a culture where that's the way people communicated the news. So I definitely think of the Dominican culture as a storytelling culture, and that's where I think, it all began. Even though I would never have been a writer, maybe I would have loved telling stories, but.
I heard some Irish writers talking about how that had got them into writing. That they were always stories around the kitchen table.
It's a story the same as the Irish writers. Southern writers in the United States, big clannish families tend to do that, the telling of stories about different members of the family. And, they create a kind of history that is formed of all these narratives that people tell. And some of them aren't even true. And sometimes you don't even care because it's such a good story.
Yes.
Is Vermont? Well, when was it I got a letter, Julia Alvarez, and I don't think it just said like Addison County, Vermont or something like that, and it found me, which tells you something about, how ethnic Vermont is. It's a very homogeneous state. It's very rural. It's very isolated. And it's very cold in the winter, and the winter lasts for a long time, but it's very good for doing your work, you see? It's a very good, it's very hard for me to write in the Dominican Republic because it's an oral culture, it's a social culture. You even go off to read and people say, ¿Y qué te pasa? ¿Te sientes mal? They feel like there's something wrong by you engaging in such a solitary activity, like you're upset or you're being antisocial. So the solitude of Vermont, the focus, the cold, helps me. It's like a blank page. It helps me to do my work there. But I dry up and I get very cold. And so part of the year we go to the Dominican Republic, and we've started a farm up in the mountains where we're growing organic, shade-grown coffee. And the proceeds from all this money we're going to make from selling this coffee, Gracia, is funding a literacy and art center on the farm. So it's a project we have going. And now we go 4 times a year, 3-4 times a year. And our hope is to eventually spend part of the time there. So it's still the place that fuels me. I'm still on the phone with, La Familia and the sisters and Mommy and Papi. So there's still the connection, but there is this radical separation, which is very different for me from my sisters, for instance, who live in Latino communities within the United States, in Boston and Chicago, but not by accident of where I got a job teaching. It was Vermont. And so it's very different.
Yes.
Do you also write in Spanish, or do you have plans to write in Spanish?
Spanish is the language, it's not the language that I know how to craft. It's a language that it's la lengua de mi niñez. It's of my childhood. It has deep roots, and it has an emotionality to it. And I feel a connection because of it when I am able to speak it with someone. But it's not the language in which I came of age, in which I learned a tradition and I learned a craft. And I tell my students, English, native-born Americans, when they take a creative writing class with me and they say, I know English. I know English. I say, no, when you become a writer, you have to relearn your language. Even if it's your native language, because now you're learning it not just to communicate, but to craft it. And it's different than just knowing the language as a native speaker, being fluent, so forth. And so, when I think about that now, were I to start with English, with Spanish, it would be a whole life I would have to spend learning this craft. Chaucer, the great master of English poetry, said, "The life's so short, the craft's so long to learn," and I just don't have the years. Plus, I'm now not a Dominican writer. I'm a hybrid. There's no landmass except my books under my feet that accurately reflects the mixture that I am. So in my English, you see me sometimes speaking Spanish. And I don't mean just because here and there might be a Spanish word, but my rhythms are in there. My characters are in there. Mm-hmm. So I'm this mix, and I don't, it wouldn't be like if I were writing in Spanish, it would be a purer story, because I'm already a mixture, an impurity in that sense, that I'm, a combination. So tempted and would love to have been able to do it, but unable to, and knowing that the clock is ticking and the life is short and the craft so long to learn. Yeah? Well, because, okay. And correct me if I rephrase it in a wrong way, but you do your research on a character, and then what happens if you discover the character starts to be alive in your head and be that character, and you're writing you've made that character up in a sense from what you've learned. What happens if you learn along the way that wasn't who your character was? Something that would contradict that. Well, I suppose then what one would do is change all the names and not make it a historical novel. Or to say, this is my, one of the things that happened when I did the Mirabal book is that I went down there, it was my first historical novel, and so I thought, I went down with a little tape recorder and ready to get the truth. And I would talk to one person, and then I would talk to another person. And they were both at the same party with Trujillo there, being fresh with Minerva. And one of them would swear she heard the slap, she saw the slap that Minerva gave the dictator. And someone else would say, I was there, that never happened. She just pushed politely away and went and sat down. So what are you going to believe? And so what I finally came to believe as a historical novelist is that you hear and you try to be as thorough as you possibly can in your research. And then you have to make some choices. Because, for instance, the fact that there's some ambiguity about Camila's sexuality. My tia in the Dominican Republic said, ay, por favor, ay, Julia, pero no lo ponga. Eso no se tiene que mencionar. Don't mention it. I said, how can you do that in a novel? You have a character who is a certain way, but you're going to censor that character? Or who has this inclination in a certain way? No. You can't do that. You have to finally make a choice. And what I came to realize about Camila, and it's so refined a point that everybody says, Camila is lesbian, which, it wouldn't be a big problem. But my theory about Camila was that Camila was asexual. And she was trying to find intimacy with different people, and her strongest intimacies were with a woman, Miss Marion. But she was very removed. I mean, for some reason, Miss Marion went off finally and pissed off and got married to someone later in life. But I have to make those choices as a novelist. And sure, it's a burden of responsibility, especially when you're writing about a character who lived, and especially when you're writing about an icon. Because, you can get into a lot of trouble if you step on an icon's toes. And icons are problematic already. I think it's, to have icons is muy peligroso, very dangerous, because it's the same kind of a making of gods that creates a dictator when you have these icons who aren't human, who can't have asexuality or can't be lesbian or can't be whatever, and be who they are, that they have to be a certain way.
There is a question there.
Why was the what?
I couldn't hear.
Again, the historicity that we... Yes. I was showing them to you today. Maybe I did a disservice because maybe now when you read the novels, you won't do the work. I want you to imagine the characters in a sense. And so I want the story, like I say, novels arise out of the shortcomings of history, and I want to create these characters in your head. So even though on the cover there was a picture, actually it was a picture, they tried to do one of the original one of Salome, and then of the little girl Camila, but they couldn't reproduce the actual only photograph of Camila, so they were going to reproduce the whitened portrait. And I thought, no, because that would be continuing this legend that, this whitening of Salome, because she's our national poet, so she can't be mulatto, because we can't have a national poet who's mulatto. It would be continuing that myth, so they used instead 2 photographs of Camila. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
¿Hablo en inglés o en...?
Bueno,
¿prefiere
puedes
inglés?
hablar en español, lo podemos traducir.
Sí, bueno, vamos a probar en inglés.
No, en español, y nosotros lo podemos traducir si quiere.
No, el asunto es que en el libro, en tu libro...
Mirabal.
Nombras a un vicioso que te ayudó con alguna información.
Chiqui vicioso, sí.
Sí. Yo soy una vicioso Martínez nacida en la República Dominicana y dominicana, aunque holandesa también.
Holandesa también.
Sí. Pero hay algo más que me llamó la atención ahora que estabas hablando de Salomé Ureña de Enríquez, y es que yo fui una pupila muy, muy especial del primer grupo que se graduó en el colegio de Salomé Ureña de Enríquez. Leonor María Félix se llamaba, sí. No sé si la conoces.
Sí, pero sí.
¿Sí?
Pero no la conozco, pero ella no, la primera clase que se graduó mientras Salomé vivía.
Mientras Salomé vivía.
Así que usted no puede ser una graduada de la primera clase, porque si
sí,
no...
ella era... No, yo no.
Ah, bueno.
Yo soy alumna de la primera graduada.
Oh, maybe we should say it in English.
I am the first one.
Because there's a big participation. Especially if we're going to disagree. You want to know what's happening. Por favor, si se puede en inglés, entonces.
No, we can... my point is, it is not that I was a pupil of her, but I was a pupil of one of the first groups that
Salomé
graduated
from her instituto.
And her name is Leonor María Félix.
Uh-huh.
She has been named in some articles, in some books of Pedro Enríquez Ureña,
right.
with thanks to her because she helped him with music. That was some news for me because I knew her as a historian in the sense that she put me apart from the school, and every afternoon from 3 to 5 she gave me special lessons that I am very grateful, because she opened the whole Greek history and the whole history, Roman history, in a very lively way.
Right.
That I still am. She inspired my life. She really gave inspiration to my life. About the first part, what I told you about being a vicioso.
Right.
As you said, the connection with the family after we left for Trujillo, we have to live in the 39.
Oh,
my father was prosecuted and condemned to forced labor for life, but he had left the country already. But my brother, 12 years old, was also condemned to life in hard work and so forth, by Trujillo's regime. So, by living such a long time in Venezuela, in Curacao, in Aruba, in Holland, in Spain, in Italy, you do lose contact with your family.
Since 1939.
Intellectually also, you lose contact with the country. Mm-hmm. You don't know what is happening, and if you go there, you find yourself without family, because the family the most closest family lived in the United States and or in Mexico. So I have lost contact with them. I still have contact with a few of the viciosos, but not with this vicioso that you named. And I would like to know, who is he?
Well, maybe what we can do is catch up afterwards so that we can have a conversation about my friend Chiqui Vicioso.
Yeah.
And See, what we're probably cousins or something. And
Yes, I know.
And if we can sit down a little later and talk, maybe you and I can figure that out.
Okay, thank
And
you
we
very
can talk
much.
in Spanish.
Thank you
Okay?
very much.
Thank you.
More questions, please.
Oh, yes.
The question was
Oh,
if
yeah.
Julia has a subject for a new book.
After Salome, I was so tired. I joked, that when I heard that I had had so many babies, that I was exhausted. But I was so tired that I thought I'm going to do something new. So I wrote a picture book for children called The Secret Footprints, based on a Dominican legend of the Ciguapas, a tribe of women that are known in the Dominican Republic, but they've only been seen at a distance. No one's been able to track them down. They're beautiful women. They're like many legends of women's tribes in different parts of the world. And the reason they have a secret why they've never been discovered, and that's because their feet are on backwards. And so they walk, and their tracks go in the opposite direction. So it's a picture book. And then I just came out with a book for young readers, 8 to 12, about Latina aunt that comes to live with a Dominican family in Vermont, a divorced mother and her 2 kids. So those are already born. But I'm working now on a novel, I call it an Anne Frank of Latin America, because it struck me that for our half of the hemisphere, in the second half of the 20th century, we have had so many dictatorships. We have had our own little massacres and genocides and Holocausts, and there are no stories about the children and about the coming of age of those children in those places. And so I've often wanted that story because, if you see the Garcia girls, it's the story of the family that leaves. What about those who stayed, especially a young girl coming of age, maybe in a situation where people are disappearing, where her family has to go into hiding, where a family relative maybe is taken into forced labor, somebody disappears but nobody can talk. What would it have been like? So I'm working now on a novel, and some of the chapters are diary, that I think of it, if I have to give it a handle, like an Anne Frank, Anita of Latin America, and what that experience was like. So that's what I'm really involved in right now. So I had to go to the pilgrimages that I find myself doing. I had to go to the Anne Frank house with the first 4 chapters of my novel, and when nobody was looking, I had to lay it down on top of her book. And then when the people came by, how are you going to explain that?
Would it be a sort of Sinitas story developed on the other side?
Right, yeah.
Sinita is one of the characters in the Time of the Butterflies. That is the friend of Minerva.
Minerva's,
whose family is persecuted and he's left alone.
Right,
Yes.
right. And this is very much, although it's made up, the narrative that I'm working on, there are many stories about people that hid in closets and people that and some of it has come out in terms of the adults giving testimonial of what it was like for them. But what was it like for a young girl, 12, 13, 14, coming of age in that time? At a time when the dictator, Trujillo, because this will be said in the Dominican Republic, had a very appetite for young girls who were virgins. And, this was a fear of many families that he would one of them would catch his eye, and who could say no to him? Because the whole family might be in trouble. So, this interesting sexual tension and fear that a young girl might not fully understand, but that was part of the atmosphere there. What would it have been like? So I'm involved in that story right now.
It's almost...
Yes, La Fiesta del Chivo. Every Dominican has to read that for all kinds of reasons. I was very intrigued by the novel. I mean, it reads like a thriller. It's a very engulfing novel. And I don't know if it's because I'm Dominican. It, to me, is it's a novel that I'm glad I read and I'm very interested in it, But it isn't, to me, a great novel because I didn't understand the history in any way but to be thrilled and excited by it, titillated by it. But I think a great novel, and that's not to take anything away from that novel, because we all want to write the great novel that we haven't written yet, but it didn't reframe the history in a way that helped me to understand it.
It's because he is not Dominican?
No, I think it's because the characters and the way that the events and the action of the story took over became heavier than the resonance and the pull of the characters or the language. Do you know what I mean? Which is something I associate with thrillers where the action really involves you and excites you and you want to find, you don't care if you swallow down whole paragraphs. You don't go back like in a Proust novel and you read the paragraph and you wake up your husband and say, listen to this. And he listens to this. You know, it didn't have either with language or with its understanding of the history, a new perception for me. But that might be because I'm Dominican. You know, because I know so much the history. But maybe a lot of people who have read the novel tell me, my God, you know, I understand Latin American dictator now, that term, what it means in a way that I didn't before. Whereas for me, The Autumn of the Patriarch or even 100 Years of Solitude, you know, are novels that help me reframe and understand it in a way that is, for me, more resonant. And I don't know, you know, if it's the style or the language or what, but that's my experience of reading that novel. Was there one more?
We can have one more question because it's 9:30, and one short question, and.
You're very concerned about the past. I am very concerned about the future. I'm very happy to see you here. I know well your country. I know many children in the Dominican Republic, and I know the culture is very oral there, and I regret that so many children in your country don't have the possibilities to read, even when they like to read, because there are many children who like to read. In the schools, there are no many libraries, and when there is a library, you feel sorry about the books who are in there. I know children there who spend whole afternoons in the library and reading every book. And I saw in the country many trainings. I don't know if you know what is a training for boys to have a training to get a prof player in the United States, and those training fields, they call it trainings, to get good baseball players in the States. And I thought, wouldn't it be possible when Dominicans who live in the States could give a training in reading Dominican children and to raise good libraries in the country?
It's a very engulfing novel. And I don't know if it's because I'm Dominican. It, to me, is a very, it's a novel that I'm glad I read and I'm very interested in it, but it isn't, to me, a great novel because I didn't understand the history in any way but to be thrilled and excited by it, titillated by it. But I think a great novel, and that's not to take anything away from that novel because we all want to write the great novel that we haven't written yet, but it didn't reframe the history in a way that helped me to understand it.
It's because he is not Dominican?
No, I think it's because the characters and the way that the events and the action of the story took over became heavier than the resonance and the pull of the characters or the language. Do you know what I mean? Which is something I associate with thrillers where the action really involves you and excites you and you want to find, you don't care if you swallow down whole paragraphs. You don't go back like in a Proust novel and you read the paragraph and you wake up your husband and say, listen to this. And he listens to this. You know, it didn't have either with language or with its understanding of the history, a new perception for me. But that might be because I'm Dominican. You know, because I know so much the history. But maybe a lot of people who have read the novel tell me, my God, you know, I understand Latin American dictator now, that term, what it means in a way that I didn't before. Whereas for me, The Autumn of the Patriarch or even 100 Years of Solitude, you know, are novels that help me reframe and understand it in a way that is, for me, more resonant. And I don't know, you know, if it's the style or the language or what, but that's my experience of reading that novel. Was there one more?
We can have one more question because it's 9:30, and one short question and.
You're very concerned about the past. I am very concerned about the future. I'm very happy to see you here. I know well your country. I know many children in the Dominican Republic, and I know the culture is very oral there, and I regret that so many children in your country don't have the possibilities to read, even when they like to read, because there are many children who like to read. In the schools, there are no many libraries, and when there is a library, you feel sorry about the books who are in there. I know children there who spend whole afternoons in the library and reading every book. And I saw in the country many trainings. I don't know if you know what is a training for boys to have a training to get a prof player in the United States. And those training fields, they call it trainings, to get good baseball players in the States. And I thought, wouldn't it be possible when Dominicans who live in the States could give a training in reading Dominican children, and to raise good libraries in the country, or to raise good libraries at the school, to open doors for Dominican children at the world, and to have, because I think there is talent too in the country that is not only your talent who has been developed in the United States, but also in your own country, to develop the talents there for the children.
Okay, when you see this coffee in Holland, please buy it. It's called Alta Gracia.
Yes.
And it's our farm foundation in the Dominican Republic. My husband and I have started. We're growing organic shade-grown coffee. We discovered when we got there and joined this cooperativo of campesinos.
¿Dónde está? Where is it, your cooperative?
Más a camino a Manabao, en un pueblecito, a little village called Los Marranitos. And we discovered when we went there that there was a group of campesinos who had organized themselves against the agribusiness model of coffee under sun, deforested land with pesticides, and they asked us if we would join them. We bought a little plot, then we bought another, and I thought we would grow the coffee and start an art center for artists to come and create in this beautiful space. What did I discover? At least 90% analfabetismo. Nobody knows how to read or write. Children, adults, so we scratched the arts center. And we have a school there. It's opening in the fall.
Yes.
And this June, that's why I couldn't wait for you to be done so I could tell you. This June, we have a youth group from Wellesley, Massachusetts, and they wanted a construction project. And so one of the very popular concepts, if you've been there, you know this, they don't have libraries, but all along the streets, all along the roads, they have barras, little bars, little stands, just stocked with rum bottles. So these students are going to build for us right on the road. Everybody has to go by the farm. A barra biblioteca. And in back, instead of rum bottles, we have books, children's books in Spanish.
Okay. I hope
and
it will
is
be
now
national.
going to be staffed by the volunteers, the few people that know how to read in the town. And you can stop there on your way home and have a book read to you and then take it home. And one thing you find about an oral culture is you read a book once, and the children even know where to turn the page, you know, and they know the story. And then they become interested in the words. So between the school and our little Barra Biblioteca, we're recycling, as you mentioned, because it is a responsibility, not just to take, you know, but to recycle, just not to nature, not but to human nature, the talents. Yes. And one of the good things is that, you know, students, for instance, from the college where I teach, they're now going there for workshops, and they have to work on the farm when they take a writing workshop too, and work in the school or do some sort of project on the farm, because that concept of the recycling. And they take a lot back, believe me. Their writing is better than ever, but they also leave a lot behind.
Can you give me the address of your organization? No,
sure.
Is it possible to visit it in Dominican Republic and to do
sure.
more with that idea?
And we invite groups to come, and we don't charge very much, but we charge to fund.
From schools?
Yeah, we have groups that are going. We have this group, the youth group. We have a group of women who go and they do a women's workshop.
Okay. I'm very interested in it because I do many.
Talk to this man.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
You didn't know that I had this other incarnation. You know, we're here not just to sell books, we're here to sell coffee, we take donations. Actually, this is the only bag we have.
Perfect ending question.
Okay. Well, Julia, you're magnificent. It's unbelievable. You're not only a great writer and storyteller, but also a good salesperson, I think. You should have taken your coffee with it. Well, thank you so much again, Julia. You had a very excellent talk, and I really liked your slideshow as well. Your story gave me the feeling of being in a dream, and the only thing I want to do is take off and go to Latin America. It's beautiful. Thank you also, Magdalena. Your contributions makes us even more aware of the literary abilities of Julia's work. I hope you all enjoyed the evening, and as I mentioned before, Julia will take time to sign the books, and tomorrow she will be in the Bijenkorf, I believe, but tonight she's here. Before I leave you for a drink and maybe a little talk with Julia, I want to stress our next event on April 25th with the John Adams Institute. We will have the former ambassador to the Netherlands, Mr. Paul Bremer, as our guest. Mr. Bremer will talk about a totally different subject, about international terrorism in general and the changes of this threat. Bremer has advised American Congress only recently about this topic. He will talk about this important safety issues and will go into discussion with Marianne van Leeuwen of the Institute of Klingendael and with our former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hans van der Broek. The lecture will be in the Yakultzaal in the Beurs van Berlage. Like I said, on the 25th of April. We'll start at 8 o'clock. I hope you can mark this date in the calendar. And one more thing, on 14th of June, we will have Laurie Moore, and that will be in the Rode so please all come. And in your way out, you will find our information stand where you can sign up for the lectures and hopefully pick up a brochure and become a member or a sponsor or a friend from the John Adams Institute. Well, thank you all and hope to see you all soon. Bye.